Chapter 11. Queen Athaliah of Judah. This is also told in 2 Chronicles 22, 10-12. As soon as Athaliah heard that her son King Ahaziah was dead, she decided to kill any relative who could possibly become king. She would have been yet dead, but Jehoshaphat rescued Joash, son of Ahaziah, just as he was about to be murdered. Jehoshaphat, who was Jehoram's daughter and Ahaziah's half-sister, hid her nephew Joash and his personal servant in a bedroom in the Lord's temple, where he was safe from Athaliah. Joash hid in the temple with Jehoshaphat for 6 years while Athaliah ruled as queen of Judah. Jehoiada makes Joash king of Judah. This is also told in 2 Chronicles 23, 1-21. Joash, son of Ahaziah, had hidden in the Lord's temple 6 years. Then in the 7th year, Jehoiada the priest sent for the commanders of the king's special bodyguards and the commanders of the palace guards. They met him at the temple, and he asked them to make a promise in the name of the Lord. Then he brought out Joash and said to them, "Here's what I want you to do. 3 of your guard units will be on duty on the Sabbath. I want 1 unit to guard the palace, another unit will guard Sur Gate, and the 3rd unit will guard the palace gate and relieve the palace guards. The other 2 guard units are supposed to be off duty on the Sabbath, but I want both of them to stay here at the temple and protect King Joash. Make sure they follow him wherever he goes, and tell them to keep their swords ready to kill anyone who tries to get near him." The commanders followed Jehoiada's orders. Each one called together his guards, those coming on duty and those going off duty. Jehoiada brought out the swords and shields that had belonged to King David and gave them to the commanders. Then they gave the weapons to their guards, who took their positions around the temple and the altar to protect Joash on every side. Jehoiada brought Joash outside, where he placed the crown on his head and gave him a copy of instructions for ruling the nation. Olive oil was poured on his head to show that he was now king, while the crowd clapped and shouted, "Long live the king!" Queen Athaliah heard the crowd and went to the temple. There she saw Joash standing by one of the columns, which was the usual place for the king. The singers and the trumpet players were standing next to him, and the people were celebrating and blowing trumpets. Athaliah tore her clothes in anger and shouted, "You betrayed me, you traitors!" Straightway Jehoiada said to the army commanders, "Kill her, but don't do it anywhere near the Lord's temple. Take her out in front of the troops and kill anyone who is with her." So the commanders dragged her to the gate, where horses are led into the palace, and they killed her there. Jehoiada the priest asked King Joash and the people to promise that they would be faithful to each other and to the Lord. Then the crowd went to the temple built to honor Baal and tore it down. They smashed the altars and idols and killed Matan, the priest of Baal, in front of the altars. After Jehoiada had placed the guards around the Lord's temple, he called together all the commanders, the king's special bodyguards, the palace guards, and the people. They led Joash from the temple through the guards' gate and into the palace. He took his place on the throne and became king of Judah. Everyone celebrated because Athaliah had been killed, and Jerusalem was placed peaceful again. Joash was only 7 years old when this happened. Chapter 12. King Joash of Judah. This is also told in 2 Chronicles 24, 1-14, 16. Joash became king of Judah in Jehu's 7th year as king of Israel, and he ruled 40 years from Jerusalem. His mother Zibiah was from the town of Beersheba. Jehoiada the priest taught Joash what was right, and so for the rest of his life Joash obeyed the Lord. But even Joash did not destroy the local shrines, and they were still used as places for offering sacrifices. One day Joash said to the priest, "Collect all the money that has been given to the Lord's temple, whether from taxes or gifts, and use it to repair the temple. You priests can contribute your own money too." But the priests never started repairing the temple. So in the 23rd year of his rule, Joash called for Jehoiada and the other priests and said, "Why aren't you using the money to repair the temple? Don't take any more money for yourselves. It is only to be used to pay for the repairs." The priests agreed that they would not collect any more money or be in charge of the temple repairs. Jehoiada found a wooden box. He cut a hole in the top of it and set it on the right side of the altar where people went into the temple. Whenever someone gave money to the temple, the priests guarding the entrance would put it into this box. When the box was full of money, the king's secretary and the chief priest would count the money and put it in bags. Then they would give it to the men supervising the repairs to the temple. Some of the money was used to pay the builders, the woodworkers, the stonecutters, and the men who built the walls. And some was used to buy wood and stone and to pay any other costs for repairing the temple. While the repairs were being made, the money that was given to the temple was not used to make silver bowls, lamp snuffers, small sprinkling bowls, trumpets, or anything gold or silver for the temple. It went only to pay for repairs. The men in charge were honest, so no one had to keep track of the money. The fines that had to be paid, along with the sacrifices to make things right and the sacrifices for sin, did not go to the temple. This money belonged only to the priests. About the same time, King Hazael of Syria attacked the town of Gath and captured it. Next, he decided to attack Jerusalem, so Joash collected everything he and his ancestors Jehoshaphat, Jehoram, and Ahaziah had dedicated to the Lord, as well as the gold in the storage rooms in the temple and palace. He sent it all to Hazael as a gift, and when Hazael received it, he ordered his troops to leave Jerusalem. Everything else Joash did while he was king is written in the history of the kings of Judah. At the end of his rule, some of his officers rebelled against him. Josabad, son of Shimeath, and Jehoshaphat, son of Shomer, murdered him in a building where the land was filled in on the east side of Jerusalem, near the road to Shiloh. Joash was buried beside his ancestors in Jerusalem, and his son Amaziah became king. Chapter 13. King Jehoahaz of Israel. Jehoahaz, son of Jehu, became king of Israel in the 23rd year of Joash's rule in Judah. Jehoahaz ruled 17 years from Samaria and disobeyed the Lord by doing wrong. He never stopped following the example of Jeroboam, who had caused the Israelites to sin. The Lord was angry with the Israelites, so he let King Hazael of Syria and his son Ben-Hadad rule over them for a long time. Jehoahaz prayed to the Lord for help, and the Lord saw how terribly Hazael was treating the Israelites. He answered Jehoahaz by sending Israel a leader who rescued them from the Syrians, and the Israelites lived in peace as they had before. But Hazael had defeated Israel's army so badly that Jehoahaz had only 10 chariots, 50 cavalry troops, and 10,000 regular soldiers left in his army. The Israelites kept sinning and following the example of Jeroboam's family. They did not tear down the sacred poles that had been set up in Samaria for the worship of the goddess Asherah. Everything else Jehoahaz did while he was king, including his brave deeds, is written in the history of the kings of Israel. Jehoahaz died and was buried in Samaria, and his son Jehoash became king. King Jehoash of Israel. Jehoash became king of Israel in the 37 years of Joash's rule in Judah, and he ruled 16 years from Samaria. He disobeyed the Lord by doing just like Jeroboam, who had caused the Israelites to sin. Everything else Jehoash did while he was king, including his war against King Amaziah of Judah, is written in the history of the kings of Israel. Joash died and was buried in Samaria beside the other Israelite kings. His son Jeroboam then became king. Elisha the prophet dies. Sometime before the death of King Jehoash, the prophet was very sick and about to die. Joash went in and stood beside him, crying. He said, Master, what will Israel's chariots and cavalry be able to do without you? Grab a bow and some arrows, Elisha told him, and hold them in your hand. Joash grabbed the bow and arrows and held them. Elisha placed his hand on the king's hand and said, Open the window facing east. When it was open, Elisha shouted, Now shoot. Joash shot an arrow, and Elisha said, That arrow is a sign that the Lord will help you completely defeat the Syrian army at Aphek. Elisha said, Pick up the arrows and hit the ground with them. Joash grabbed the arrows and hit the ground 3 times, then stopped. Elisha became angry with the king and exclaimed, If you had struck it 5 or 6 times, you would completely wipe out the Syrians. Now you will defeat them only 3 times. Elisha died and was buried. Every year in the spring, Moab's leaders sent raiding parties into Israel. Once, while some Israelites were burying a man's body, they saw a group of Moabites. The Israelites quickly threw the body into Elisha's tomb and ran away. As soon as the man's body touched the bones of Elisha, the man came back to life and stood up. Israel defeats Syria. Israel was under the power of King Hazael of Syria during the entire rule of Jehoahaz. But the Lord was kind to the Israelites and showed them mercy because of his solemn agreement with their ancestors Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In fact, he has never turned his back on them or let them be completely destroyed. Hazael died, and his son Ben-Hadad then became king of Syria. King Jehoash of Israel attacked and defeated the Syrian army 3 times. He took back from Ben-Hadad all the towns Hazael had captured in battle from his father Jehoahaz. Chapter 14, King Amaziah of Judah. This is also told in 2 Chronicles 25, 1-24. Amaziah, son of Joash, became king of Judah in the 2nd year of Jehoash's rule in Israel. Amaziah was 25 years old when he became king, and he ruled 29 years from Jerusalem, which was also the hometown of his mother Jehoadin. Amaziah followed the example of his father Joash by obeying the Lord and doing right, but he was not as faithful as his ancestor David. Amaziah did not destroy the local shrines, and they were still used as places for offering sacrifices. As soon as Amaziah had control of Israel, he arrested and killed the officers who had murdered his father. But the children of those officers were not killed. The Lord had commanded in the law of Moses that only the people who sinned were to be punished, not their parents or children. While Amaziah was king, he killed 10,000 Edomites soldiers in Salt Valley. He captured the town of Selah and renamed it Joktheel, which is still its name. One day, Amaziah sent a message to King Jehoash of Israel, Come out and face me in battle. Joash sent back this reply, Once upon a time, a small thorn bush in Lebanon announced that his son was going to marry the daughter of a large cedar tree, but a wild animal came along and trampled the small bush. Amaziah, you think you were so powerful because you defeated Edom. Go ahead and celebrate, but stay at home. If you cause any trouble, both you and your kingdom of Judah will be destroyed. But Amaziah refused to listen, so Jehoash and his troops marched to the town of Beth Shemesh in Judah to attack Amaziah and his troops. During the battle, Judah's army was crushed, and every soldier from Judah ran back home, and Joash captured Amaziah. Joash then marched to Jerusalem and broke down the city wall from Ephraim Gate to Corner Gate, a section nearly 200 meters long. He took the gold and silver, as well as everything of value from the Lord's temple and the king's treasury. He took hostages, then returned to Samaria. Everything else Joash did while he was king, including his brave deeds and how he defeated King Amaziah of Judah, is written in the history of the kings of Israel. Joash died and was buried in Samaria beside the other Israelite kings. His son Jeroboam then became king. 15 years after Joash died, some people in Jerusalem plotted against Amaziah. He was able to escape to the town of Lachish, but another group of people caught him and killed him there. His body was taken back to Jerusalem on horseback and buried beside his ancestors. Everything else Amaziah did while he was king is written in the history of the kings of Judah. After his death, the people of Judah made his son Araziah king, even though he was only 16 at the time. Araziah was the one who later recaptured and rebuilt the town of Elath. King Jeroboam, the second of Israel. Jeroboam, son of Jehoash, became king of Israel in the 15th year of Amaziah's rule in Judah. Jeroboam ruled 41 years from Samaria. He disobeyed the Lord by following the evil example of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, who had caused the Israelites to sin. Jeroboam extended the boundaries of Israel from Lebo-Hamath in the north to the Dead Sea in the south, just as the Lord had promised his servant Jonah, son of Amittai, who was a prophet from Gath-Hepher. The Lord helped Jeroboam do this because he had seen how terribly the Israelites were suffering, whether slave or free, and no one was left to help them. And since the Lord had promised that he would not let Israel be completely destroyed, he helped Jeroboam rescue them. Everything else Jeroboam did while he was king, including his brave deeds and how he recaptured the towns of Damascus and Hamath, is written in the history of the kings of Israel. Jeroboam died and was buried, and his son Zechariah became king. Chapter 15, King Azariah of Judah. This is also told in 2 Chronicles 26, 1-23. Azariah, son of Amaziah, became king of Judah in Jeroboam's 27th year as king of Israel. He was only 16 years old when he became king, and he ruled 52 years from Jerusalem, which was also the hometown of his mother, Jecholiah. Azariah obeyed the Lord by doing right, as his father Amaziah had done. But Azariah did not destroy the local shrines, and they were still used as places for offering sacrifices. The Lord punished Azariah with leprosy for the rest of his life. He wasn't allowed to live in the royal palace, so his son Jotham lived there and ruled in his palace. Everything else Azariah did while he was king is written in the history of the kings of Judah. Azariah died and was buried beside his ancestors in Jerusalem. His son Jotham then became king. King Zechariah of Israel. Zechariah, son of Jeroboam, became king of Israel in the 38th year of Azariah's rule in Judah, but he ruled only 6 months from Samaria. Like his ancestors, Zechariah disobeyed the Lord by following the evil ways of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, who had caused the Israelites to sin. Shallum, son of Jabesh, plotted against Zechariah and killed him in public. Shallum then became king, so the Lord had kept his promise to Jehu that the next 4 kings of Israel would come from his family. Everything else Zechariah did while he was king is written in the history of the kings of Israel. King Shallum of Israel. Shallum became king of Israel in the 39th year of Azariah's rule in Judah, but only 1 month after Shallum became king. Menahem, son of Gadi, came to Samaria from Tirzah and killed him. Menahem then became king. Town of Tipsha would not surrender to him, so he destroyed it and all the surrounding towns as far as Tirzah. He killed everyone living in Tipsha, and with his sword he even ripped open pregnant women. Everything else Shalom did while he was king, including his plot against Zechariah, is written in the history of the kings of Israel. King Menahem of Israel. Menahem became king of Israel in Azariah's 39th year as king of Judah, and he ruled Israel 10 years from Samaria. He constantly disobeyed the Lord by following the example of Jeroboam son of Nebat, who had caused the Israelites to sin. During Menahem's rule, King Tiglath-Pileser of Assyria invaded Israel. He agreed to help Menahem keep control of his kingdom if Menahem would pay him 34,000 kilograms of silver. So Menahem ordered every rich person in Israel to give him 50 pieces of silver, and he gave it all to Tiglath-Pileser, who stopped his attack and left Israel. Everything else Menahem did while he was king is written in the history of the kings of Israel. Menahem died, and his son Pekahiah became king. King Pekahiah of Israel. Pekahiah became king of Israel in the 50th year of Azariah's rule in Judah, and he ruled 2 years from Samaria. He disobeyed the Lord and caused the Israelites to sin, just as Jeroboam son of Nebat and Dan. Pekah son of Remaliah was Pekahiah's chief officer, but he made plans to kill the king. So he and 50 men from Gilead broke into the strongest part of the palace in Samaria and murdered Pekahiah, together with Argob and Ariek. Pekah then became king. Everything else Pekahiah did while he was king is written in the history of the kings of Israel. King Pekah of Israel. Pekah son of Remaliah became king of Israel in Azariah's 52nd year as king of Judah, and he ruled 20 years from Samaria. He disobeyed the Lord and followed the evil example of Jeroboam son of Nebat, who had caused the Israelites to sin. During Pekah's rule, King Tiglath-Pileser of Assyria marched into Israel. He captured the territories of Gilead and Galilee, including the towns of Ijon, Abel, Beth-Maachah, Janoah, Kadesh, and Hazor, as well as the entire territory of Naphtali. Then he took Israelites from those regions to Assyria as prisoners. In the 20th year of Jotham's rule in Judah, Hosea, son of Elah, plotted against Pekah and murdered him. Hosea then became king of Israel. Everything else Pekah did while he was king is written in the history of the kings of Israel. King Jotham of Judah. This is also told in 2 Chronicles 27, 1-9. Jotham, son of Azariah, became king of Judah in the 2nd year of Pekah's rule in Israel. Jotham was 25 years old when he became king, and he ruled 16 years from Jerusalem. His mother Jerusha was the daughter of Zadok. Jotham followed the example of his father by obeying the Lord and doing right. It was Jotham who rebuilt the upper gate that led into the court around the Lord's temple. But the local shrines were not destroyed, and they were still used as places for offering sacrifices. Everything else Jotham did while he was king is written in the history of the kings of Judah. During his rule, the Lord let King Rezin of Syria and King Pekah of Israel start attacking Judah. Jotham died and was buried beside his ancestors in Jerusalem, and his son Ahaz became king.